Have you ever wondered how a civilization as mighty, as wealthy, and as advanced as the Roman Empire could collapse so completely that Europe fell into centuries of chaos? How an empire that ruled from the Atlantic Ocean to the deserts of Syria, from Britain to North Africa, could crumble not in one day, but in a long storm of wars, invasions, betrayals, and political disasters? And the biggest question of all, was Rome destroyed by its enemies, or did it slowly destroy itself from within? In this video, I am going to discuss all of these questions. So without any delay, let's start. When we think about the fall of Rome, we usually picture invading barbarians storming the gates, burning cities, and crushing legions. But the truth is far more complex. Rome didn't fall because of one enemy or one battle. It fell because the empire became trapped in a cycle of endless wars on its borders. Wars inside its borders and wars among its own people. These conflicts drained its resources, shattered its unity, and slowly turned the world's strongest empire into a fragile shell waiting to collapse. To understand how it all began, we need to go back to the 3rd century, the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome had been expanding for centuries, conquering Gaul, Egypt, Greece, and half the known world. But the more it grew, the harder it became to defend. New threats appeared everywhere. In the east, a powerful new empire rose, the Sassanid Persians under kings like Shapur I, who were far more aggressive and organized than the old Parthians. In the north, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Franks, and Alemanni were becoming stronger, more united, and far more daring. And inside Rome, ambition grew faster than loyalty. The crisis truly began when foreign armies and internal political struggles collided. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had over 20 emperors, many murdered by their own soldiers. The empire was practically ruled by whoever the legions declared emperor. This meant constant civil war. A general in the west would proclaim himself emperor, another in the east would do the same. And suddenly Rome was fighting itself while its enemies poured across the borders. The frontiers collapsed. The Alemanni broke into Italy. The Goths ravaged Greece and even threatened the wealthy city of Thessalonica. The Persians captured Roman territories in Syria and sacked Antioch. But the worst humiliation came when Shapur I captured Emperor Valerian alive. No Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner. Rumor says the Persian king used Valerian as a human footstool before eventually killing him. Whether that detail is true or not, the psychological damage to Rome was enormous. The once invincible empire now looked weak. But internal divisions were even worse. The empire literally split apart. A Gallic empire emerged in the west, controlling Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain. In the east, a breakaway kingdom centered in Palmyra under Queen Zenobia rose and conquered Egypt and the eastern provinces. Rome was being torn apart not just by foreign wars, but by rebellions, usurpations, and ambitious leaders carving out their own miniature empires. Still, Rome managed to recover temporarily under Emperor Aurelian. He defeated the Palmyrene Empire, reclaimed the Gallic territories, strengthened the borders, and earned the title Restorer of the World. But even he couldn't fix the deeper decay. After his assassination, the cycle of instability returned. And even when Diocletian came to power and created major reforms including dividing the empire into an eastern and western half, the unity had already been fractured. Diocletian's reforms stabilized things for a while, but they also made it clear Rome was now too large for one man to control. This division would haunt the empire forever. The stronger Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, would survive for almost 1,000 years. The weaker Western Roman Empire, however, would face the full force of migrations, invasions, and wars it was too exhausted to handle. And that brings us to the next phase of destruction, the arrival of new and terrifying forces on Rome's borders. In the late 4th century, everything changed when a fearsome nomadic people known as the Huns stormed into Europe from the east. Their arrival set off a chain reaction. Tribes who had lived peacefully near Rome's borders, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Alans, suddenly found themselves facing annihilation. They begged Rome for protection, hoping to settle as peaceful allies inside the empire. Rome agreed, but treated them terribly. Corruption, cruelty, and mistreatment pushed the Visigoths to revolt. In 378 AD, they confronted Rome in one of the most devastating battles in Roman history, the Battle of Adrianople. Emperor Valens, underestimating the Goths, rushed into battle without waiting for reinforcements. The result was catastrophic. The Roman army was encircled. 2/3 of it was slaughtered, and Emperor Valens died on the battlefield. Never before had a Roman field army been destroyed so completely by a barbarian group. This was a turning point. Rome realized it could no longer easily crush its enemies. It was now negotiating, paying, and even recruiting entire tribes as soldiers. The empire was still huge, but it was slowly losing control of its own destiny. After Adrianople, Rome made a deal with the Visigoths, settling them inside the empire as foederati, semi-independent allies. It was a risky move. These were warriors who had already defeated Rome once, and they had no reason to fully obey Roman commands. Meanwhile, other groups learned from their success. More tribes began crossing the borders not as raiders, but as whole nations seeking land, safety, and opportunity. All of this weakened the Western Empire even further. The economy was shrinking. Taxation was crushing. Armies were shrinking and increasingly filled with foreign recruits whose loyalty depended on payment Rome could barely afford. And while all this was happening, the political system continued to collapse. Emperors came and went like shadows. Some ruled for months, some were puppets of generals. And while Roman leaders fought each other, the frontiers broke open. One of the most symbolic moments came in 410 AD, when Alaric, king of the Visigoths, marched into Italy and sacked Rome itself. For Romans, this was unthinkable. Rome hadn't been taken by an enemy in nearly 800 years. People said the world was ending. Superstitions spread. Pagans blamed Christians. Christians blamed sinners. But the truth was simpler. Rome had created enemies it couldn't control, and those enemies had learned Rome's weaknesses. Even after the sack, the Western Empire limped on. It still had armies, territories, and resources, but it was now fighting for survival. The Vandals moved into Spain and then crossed into North Africa, Rome's richest province. Losing Africa was like losing the empire's heart. Grain shipments stopped. Wealth vanished. The Western Empire's last main source of income was gone. And the enemies kept coming. The Huns under Attila launched devastating invasions across Gaul and Italy. Though Rome survived through alliances, diplomacy, and desperate battles, the cost was crippling. Meanwhile, new barbarian kingdoms were forming inside the empire. They weren't just raiding anymore. They were building their own worlds. By the mid-5th century, real power in the Western Empire belonged not to the emperors, but to military strongmen like Stilicho, Aetius, and Ricimer, men who commanded armies filled with barbarian warriors. Political assassinations became routine. Betrayal was expected. And each time a strong leader was killed, the empire weakened even further. By now, the empire was like a dying beast surrounded by predators. As the Western Empire weakened, its enemies grew more confident. In 455 AD, another disaster struck. Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals led by King Genseric. Unlike Alaric's Visigoths, who had only looted selectively, the Vandals stripped the city clean. They took treasures, artworks, even captives, and sailed back to North Africa, turning Carthage into a powerful capital that dominated the Western Mediterranean. Rome was no longer feared. It was no longer respected. It was now a symbol of fading reminder of past greatness. The Western Empire was collapsing internally as much as it was externally. Rival generals controlled different regions. The Visigoths ruled in Gaul and Spain. The Burgundians carved out their own kingdom. The Suebi had their territories. The Vandals were firmly in Africa. The Ostrogoths lingered in the east, waiting for their moment. The empire wasn't truly falling, it was dissolving piece by piece into smaller worlds that no longer needed Rome. One of the most striking things is how normal people experienced this. Many didn't feel the empire collapsing. They simply saw local leaders taking over. Taxes were still collected. Markets still ran. Life went on. But little by little, Roman laws, Roman culture, and Roman identity were fading. It was like watching a mighty statue crack slowly. Each fracture seemed small, but eventually the entire structure was beyond repair. And then came the final decades. What was left of the Western Empire became a puppet of barbarian generals who placed child emperors on the throne just to have someone to control. The most famous of these was the young emperor Romulus Augustulus. His name was symbolic, a child named after both Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor. Perhaps people hoped his reign would be a new beginning. Instead, it became the end. By the late 470s, a Germanic military leader named Odoacer rose to great power. He led armies made up of various barbarian groups who had long served Rome but now demanded land and recognition. When the Roman authorities couldn't satisfy these demands, Odoacer made a decision that would change history forever. In 476 AD, he marched into Ravenna, the Western Empire's last capital, deposed Romulus Augustulus, and declared himself ruler of Italy. And here's the most important part. He didn't bother appointing a new emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and told the Eastern Emperor that the West no longer needed a separate ruler. In that moment, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, not with a grand battle, not with a dramatic destruction, but with a quiet political act. It ended because it no longer had the strength to continue. But the story doesn't actually end with 476 AD. The idea of Rome lived on. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, continued for nearly 1,000 more years. And in the old Western territories, new kingdoms emerged that blended Roman and barbarian cultures. The Visigoths became Christian kings in Spain. The Franks rose in Gaul. The Anglo-Saxons settled in Britain. Europe was being reshaped not as a collapse into nothingness, but as the birth of a new world. Still, we must ask the deeper questions. Why did Rome fall? And could it have survived? Some point to economics: heavy taxation, corrupt officials, a massive military budget, and a shrinking population. Others blame politics: weak emperors, endless civil wars, and power-hungry generals who destroyed unity. Some emphasize the external threats: the Persians in the east, the Huns, Goths, and Vandals in the west, the constant pressure from migrating peoples. And some focus on internal decay: declining civic loyalty, weakened cities, failing infrastructure, and a society unable to sustain its own defenses. The truth is, it wasn't one cause. The fall of Rome was a chain reaction. When external threats increased, internal unity became more important. But Rome was fractured. When internal politics failed, the military became unstable. When the military weakened, enemies crossed the borders. When wars drained resources, the economy collapsed. When the economy collapsed, people lost faith in the government. And when people lost faith, the empire began to crack. Could Rome have survived? Possibly, if strong leadership had emerged earlier and held the empire together. If the government had reformed taxation, treated foreign tribes better, or strengthened the frontiers, perhaps the collapse could have been delayed. But the empire had simply grown too large, too complex, and too vulnerable. The world around it had changed, and Rome had failed to change with it. Yet even in its fall, Rome transformed the world. The wars that destroyed the empire also created the Europe that would follow. Roman ideas of law, citizenship, religion, engineering, and governance continued to shape societies for centuries. The Catholic Church carried forward Roman traditions. Medieval kingdoms built on Roman foundations. Even the concept of empires from Charlemagne to Napoleon borrowed from Rome's legacy. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we are not talking about the end of civilization. We are talking about the end of one form of civilization and the beginning of another. Rome didn't die, it evolved, fragmented, and spread across Europe in new forms. And that's the remarkable thing. The empire collapsed, but Rome never truly disappeared. It lived on in language, culture, law, roads, cities, and in the imagination of people who would one day call themselves heirs of Rome. So now I want to ask you something. In your opinion, what was the single most important cause behind the fall of Rome? Was it the invasions, the civil wars, the economic collapse, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to know how you see the end of one of the greatest empires in history.